Three extraordinary changes where people made a journey. But there's one more which is very moving to me, and I'm going home to preach on July the 18th on the 400th year of the anniversary of St. Edmund Campion being hanged. Edmund Campion and Thomas More were born in the same area. Edmund Campion's father had a bookshop almost touching St. Paul's Cathedral. Thomas More lived about 70 yards up one of the roads off. Of course, More was the elder. More almost certainly must have known Campion's father because More loved books and Campion's father had a bookshop. St. Edmund Campion was a poor man. His brother was a soldier. He won a scholarship from the Grocers' Guild and he went to school. When he went to school, the Blessed Sacrament was still believed in. Henry VIII was still alive, and therefore the Catholic Church, though cut off from Rome, still had the seven sacraments. We talk about our kids having troubles today. Campion's troubles, those kids at school in that period, he started with the Eucharist. The moment Henry VIII died, he'd have been about 10. The Blessed Sacrament was abolished. Our Lady's statue was thrown into the streets. All the altars were turned round, and suddenly the kids, in the middle of their lives, found themselves Protestants. So he went to Oxford. He won a scholarship to Oxford. He lived on scholarships. He was very clever and was a poor man who made his way. Then Bloody Mary, that poor queen, became queen, and she brought the Blessed Sacrament back again. So for about 5 years in Oxford, Campion went back to what he'd learnt in the first grade and which he'd given up in the 5th grade. And then when Bloody Mary died after only 5 years, then Queen Elizabeth arrived. God knows what she thought, and she was an impossible person. Anne Boleyn's daughter, you couldn't have a more dubious pedigree. And and she brought back a sort of washed out Protestantism, and Campion had to follow that. And then a terrible moment came in Campion's life when it was made law that anyone who was practicing in Oxford or in universities on a scholarship had to go to the Protestant church and take the oath of allegiance to the Queen and receive communion. So Campion didn't know what he believed. And like Mother Seton, only he was even less certain, he not only went and took the oath of allegiance, but he accepted diaconate in the Episcopalian Church. And for 5 years, as a don at Oxford, very popular, very handsome, he practiced as an Episcopalian. But he had a nervous breakdown practically, as far as they did in those sensible days. He went all white and got irritable and worried, and eventually he fled to Ireland, and then he fled from Ireland to France and went to the seminary at Douai and was received back into the church. And he was so upset spiritually, like Newman was. This is a great strain in a person's life, that he wouldn't allow the students at Douai to come with him. He didn't want to have anything more to do with England. He let them walk from the north coast of Belgium for one day. The students came with him. Then they saw him off, and he walked right across Europe from Belgium to Rome on foot. A don from Oxford who knew him well passed him on the way and thought he'd been robbed and offered to lend him money, and went back to Oxford and said, "We've just seen Edmund Campion, who was the proctor at the time, rushing across Europe." When he got to Rome, he joined the Jesuits, though he'd never heard of them before. There were no Jesuits in England, and no Jesuit general was thinking of going to England. He joined the Jesuits because he was an academic, and they had schools. And the Austrian provincial had a battle over him, as he describes, and eventually he went to Bohemia, to Prague, and did his novitiate and taught boys. He wrote the school play. He preached occasionally. He had no desire to come back to England at all. He spoke Latin, and therefore that was the common language. He loved England, but he never wanted particularly to come back. When he heard of some of the young priests dying and being hanged, he taught them at Douai. He never said, oh, I feel ashamed. He said, I hope they'll pray for me now. Their poor old master teaching out here. He was quite happy. Then an extraordinary thing happened that the general of the Jesuits was persuaded eventually to send Jesuits back to England. And they all unanimously in Rome said, the chap to go back is Campion. He was a friend of the Queen Elizabeth. He was a great man at court. He was a Don at Oxford, just like Newman. So they wrote Campion and said, will you go back to England? The last thing he had planned. He would never have joined the Jesuits if he thought England was concerned. If he'd want to go back to England, he would have become a priest at Douai. Well, it's interesting to note that two other Jesuits were asked the same thing. Will you go back and risk your life on the English mission? One man, a very nice man indeed, John Gibbons, Father Gibbons, he wrote to the general saying, I'm too afraid. I haven't the courage, but I'd love to work for England, and that's why it was country, and he did. He wrote a marvelous book later on the English martyrs, but he didn't want to go back. The second Jesuit asked, Christopher Perkins, said, I'll go back on condition I can take the oath of allegiance to the Queen and go to the Episcopalian services. Christopher Perkins left the society, left the church, later became Sir Christopher Perkins, the British ambassador in Copenhagen, and a great man in court. And once when a Jesuit was head up before the Privy Council, he had an ex-Jesuit sitting there judging him. The third man asked, and the first in time, was Campion, who didn't want to go back at all, and Campion said yes. So he left Bohemia, his mind full of his boys. In 1579, he got to England with great danger, all in disguise. A year later, he knew he was going to be hanged. He knew he hadn't got a chance. Made no bones about it. When they discussed in Rome that they should wear some kind of disguise, and Father Parsons and the others all wore feathers and swords and pretended they were coming back from the army in the Netherlands, Campion said to him, he put on a shabby cloak over a piece of buckram, and he said to him who went to England to be hanged, any kind of apparel was enough. That was his most striking statement. He knew quite well he would be hanged. Well, he landed, and for 1 year, he had the most sensational time. He became a hero. He was chased all around England. He escaped in an amazing way. He wrote this famous book in England, in hiding, and put it on all the benches in Oxford for the prize day, his 10 Reasons. It took a year for them to catch him, and they hanged, and eventually he was tortured tremendously, talk about Russia, and was hanged. Now, the extraordinary thing, Mother Seton and Cardinal Newman and St. Paul, Campion's different to all the others in this. 1 year changed his life. Had he stayed in Bohemia, we would have never even heard his name. He was a schoolmaster. 1 or 2 dusty old books might have remembered him as a Don at Oxford. But just when he said yes, though he didn't want to go back at all and was terrified, his last year made him the greatest of all the martyrs. All his life and all the things he went through, and he was a very wonderful man, only came to fruition because he lived from 1580 to 1581, which gives us hope. If you've got 1 more year left, you may pull off the same trick. It's the most extraordinary thing. As I remember Malcolm Muggeridge said, if Hitler had died 6 years earlier, he would have been one of the greatest generals in the history of Europe. And the poor old President Truman, if he'd died 5 or 6 years, we never even heard of him, except in Missouri. Truman only became known by accident. Campion would not have been a saint, we wouldn't even know his name. But that he said yes when the general wrote to him and said, will you go back? He went back, and with terrible torture and things, he died. His sermon at Tyburn, just before he was hanged on December the 1st, with 2 others of his friends, He took as his text from 1 Corinthians, we are made a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. So therefore, in our retreat, we've stopped now, we've seen St. Ignatius leave Spain. He only went back once for a short visit in all his life. He spent his whole life writing letters. And Philip Neri left Florence and never went back ever, though it's only 60 miles away. He spent the whole of his life inside Rome. St. Teresa spent all her life founding Carmelite convents in Spain. St. Francis Xavier went right out to the Indies. The four of those were canonized on the same day. We see St. Athanasius being persecuted and coming all the way from Egypt to Trier and passing on the monastic spirit there. But what I find very moving is these 3 or 4 I mentioned today, Campion, St. Elizabeth Seton, Cardinal Newman, and St. Paul, people who had to change their faith with all the terrible pain of losing all their old friends and then not always making new ones, and yet at the same time doing that, and the Spirit of God strong enough to make them survive. And so it's on that note that you and I ought to have hope. If you've got 1 year left, you've still got time to become a saint.